Europe declared energy independence from Russia. After decades of dependence on Russian natural gas flowing through pipelines, Russia's Ukraine invasion forced Europe to find alternatives. European leaders proclaimed success. Russian gas imports dropped from 40% of European supply to under 10%. New liquefied natural gas terminals were built in record time. Supply contracts were signed with United States, Qatar, and other producers. Energy security was achieved through diversification away from single supplier who demonstrated willingness to weaponize energy. The narrative is independence and success. The reality is that Europe traded one dependence for multiple dependencies that might be even more constraining. Europe isn't energy independent. Europe is dependent on American LNG, Qatari gas, Norwegian pipeline capacity, and Algerian exports, each with its own vulnerabilities and political complications. The dependencies are geographically diversified but strategically more complex because they involve more actors with divergent interests and less reliable supply chains, and the costs are substantially higher. European industry paying 3 to 4 times more for gas than American competitors using domestic supply. Energy-intensive manufacturing is relocating from Europe to United States and Middle East, where energy is cheaper. Europe's industrial base is hollowing out, not from lack of energy supply, but from energy costs that make European production uncompetitive. The energy trap is that Europe escaped Russian dependency, only to discover that every alternative creates new vulnerabilities. Europe is free from Russia but dependent on everyone else, and the collective dependencies might be worse than the single dependency Europe escaped. Understanding Europe's energy trap requires examining what Russian gas provided, what alternatives actually deliver, and the structural costs that diversification imposes on European competitiveness. Russian natural gas was extraordinarily valuable to European economy. Russia supplied approximately 155 billion cubic meters annually before Ukraine invasion, roughly 40% of European gas consumption. The gas arrived through pipelines, Nord Stream under Baltic Sea directly to Germany, Ukrainian transit pipelines, and Yamal pipeline through Belarus and Poland. Pipeline gas is cheap because transportation costs are minimal once infrastructure exists. Russian gas cost approximately $200 to $300 per thousand cubic meters at European border, equivalent to $6 to $9 per $1 million BTU in American pricing. This made European industry competitive in energy-intensive sectors like chemicals, fertilizers, steel, and glass manufacturing. The reliability was high despite political tensions. Russia continued supplying gas through Cold War, post-Soviet transition, Ukraine conflicts in 2006 and 2014, and various diplomatic crises. Gazprom met contractual obligations because revenue was essential for Russian budget and reputation was necessary for maintaining long-term contracts. European companies depended on this reliability for planning and investment. Chemical plants, refineries, and power stations were built assuming reliable Russian gas at predictable prices. The infrastructure investments reflected confidence in supply continuity. The Nord Stream sabotage in September 2022 eliminated the primary supply route. Explosions destroyed 3 of 4 Nord Stream pipelines carrying gas from Russia directly to Germany under Baltic Sea. The perpetrator remains officially unknown, though speculation centers on state actors with sophisticated military capabilities and interest in severing Russian-European energy ties. Regardless of who was responsible, the effect was immediate. Germany lost its primary Russian gas import route. Ukrainian transit reduced to minimal volumes as conflict intensified. Europe needed alternative supplies within months or face energy crisis. The LNG pivot was unprecedented in speed and scale. Liquefied natural gas requires cooling natural gas to 162 Celsius, which makes it liquid and reduces volume by 600 times for ship transport. Europe had limited LNG import capacity before crisis. Approximately 20% of gas supply could be delivered as LNG through existing terminals in Spain, France, Netherlands, Belgium, and Italy. Germany had 0 LNG terminals, despite being Europe's largest gas consumer and economy. Within 18 months, Germany built floating LNG import terminals at Wilhelmshaven and Brunsbüttel. Multiple countries expanded terminal capacity. By late 2023, European LNG import capacity had increased from approximately 150 billion cubic meters annually to over 250 billion cubic meters, enough to theoretically replace Russian pipeline gas. The German terminal construction achieved what normally requires 5 to 7 years in 10-12 months through emergency procedures. Wilhelmshaven Terminal used Floating Storage and Regasification Unit, FSRU, essentially a converted LNG tanker that acts as mobile terminal. The FSRU Höegh Esperance, leased from Norwegian company Höegh LNG, was positioned offshore and connected to hastily built pipeline bringing gas onshore. Environmental impact assessments that typically take 18 to 24 months were compressed to 3-4 months. Public consultation processes normally requiring multiple rounds were reduced to minimal legally required review. Construction that would normally require navigating federal and state bureaucracies operated under emergency decrees granting sweeping authority to expedite permits. The speed came at cost. The terminals are more expensive to operate than purpose-built onshore facilities. FSRU lease costs approximately $200,000–$300,000 daily, over $100 million annually. The offshore positioning requires specialized vessels for maintenance and connection to shore infrastructure. The temporary nature means long-term efficiency improvements possible with permanent facilities cannot be implemented. But the speed was necessary because winter 2022-2023 approached, and German gas storage needed filling to avoid heating crisis. The terminals worked. Germany avoided gas shortages. But the premium for speed means German gas costs remain structurally higher than if permanent infrastructure had been planned and built over normal timeline. The supply sources shifted to United States, Qatar, and other producers. American LNG exports to Europe increased from approximately 20 billion cubic meters in 2021 to over 60 billion cubic meters in 2023. The United States became Europe's largest gas supplier, providing roughly 20% of European consumption. Qatar increased exports to Europe. Algeria maintained pipeline flows through Italy and Spain. Norway increased production to maximum capacity, providing approximately 110 billion cubic meters annually, making Norway Europe's second largest supplier after United States. The diversification was real. No single supplier provides 40% of European gas, as Russia once did. But the costs of diversification are severe. LNG is significantly more expensive than pipeline gas. The liquefaction requires energy. Approximately 10% of gas volume is consumed in cooling process. Shipping requires specialized LNG tankers that cost $200–$300 million each. Regasification at import terminals requires infrastructure and energy. The total cost of LNG delivered to Europe ranges from $12–$18 per million BTU depending on global prices, double to triple the cost of Russian pipeline gas. European industries that depended on cheap gas suddenly faced costs that made operations unprofitable. The economic calculations reveal the competitive damage. A typical European chemical plant consuming $500,000 MWh of natural gas annually paid approximately $15–$20 million for Russian pipeline gas at pre-crisis prices. Post-crisis LNG prices mean the same consumption costs $40–$60 million annually, an increase of $25–$40 million. For plants operating on thin margins where energy is 32–40% of total costs, this increase eliminates profitability entirely. The choice is absorb losses hoping prices decline, pass costs to customers risking losing market share to international competitors, or reduce production and lay off workers. The electricity cost transmission amplifies the problem. Natural gas generates approximately 20% of European electricity. When gas prices triple, electricity prices increase proportionally for gas-fired generation. Even though renewables and nuclear provide majority of European electricity, marginal pricing in electricity markets means the most expensive generator sets the market price. On days when gas plants are needed for peak demand or renewable backup, electricity prices spike to gas generation costs. The result is that even electricity consumers who don't directly use gas face dramatically higher costs because gas-fired generation sets marginal prices during critical periods. The manufacturing exodus specifics show the permanent damage. ArcelorMittal reduced steel production at multiple European plants, citing energy costs. The Hamburg plant that employed 2,500 workers cut production 50%. ThyssenKrupp Steel Division explored relocating blast furnaces to regions with cheaper energy. BASF closed ammonia plants in Germany and expanded capacity in Louisiana, where gas costs 75% less. European ammonia production capacity declined approximately 25% from 2022-2024. The capacity doesn't return when prices eventually stabilize because capital investments relocated to lower-cost regions operate for 30-40 years before requiring replacement. The American LNG supply comes with strategic dependencies that constrain European autonomy. American LNG contracts are typically long-term, 10 to 20 years, with prices indexed to Henry Hub natural gas prices in United States, plus liquefaction and shipping costs. European buyers commit to purchasing specified volumes annually regardless of demand. This creates obligation where European companies must pay for gas they might not need if demand drops, or face penalties for failing to take contracted volumes. The contracts bind European energy markets to American gas markets for decades. The strategic dimension is that American gas exports require American political approval. LNG export terminals need permits from U.S. Department of Energy. American environmental groups and some politicians oppose LNG exports on climate grounds, or because domestic gas prices increase when exports rise. A future American administration could restrict exports to reduce domestic prices or as environmental policy. European dependence on American LNG means European energy security depends on American political decisions that Europeans cannot influence. This was precisely the vulnerability that Russian dependence created, and now exists with American supply. The Qatari alternative creates different complications. Qatar is world's largest LNG exporter with production capacity exceeding 100 million tons annually, equivalent to approximately 140 billion cubic meters of natural gas. Qatar can supply a substantial portion of European needs, but Qatari gas is also contracted to Asian buyers, Japan, South Korea, China, and India, who historically paid higher prices than European customers. Qatar prioritizes Asian contracts because prices are better. Europe gets Qatari gas when Asian demand is soft or when European buyers offer competitive prices. This means European supply from Qatar fluctuates with Asian market conditions beyond European control. The geopolitical complications include Qatari relationships with Iran and various regional actors that create political tensions with some European countries. Qatar shares North Field gas field with Iran, world's largest natural gas field. Qatari production depends on field that straddles maritime boundary with Iran. This creates a situation where sanctioning Iran too aggressively could complicate Qatari operations. European dependence on Qatari gas constrains European foreign policy toward Iran in ways Russian dependence never did, because Russia was adversary anyway, while Qatar requires accommodation. The Norwegian supply is reliable but limited. Norway produces approximately 120 billion cubic meters annually from North Sea fields. This is near maximum sustainable capacity. Norwegian production is mature with declining fields and limited prospects for substantial increases. Europe can depend on Norwegian gas continuing, but cannot expect growth. Norwegian supply replaces perhaps 30% of lost Russian volumes, but cannot scale to replace all Russian imports. Norway is stable supplier, but insufficient solution. The industrial migration is the most significant long-term consequence. European energy-intensive industries face electricity and gas costs that are 3 to 4 times higher than competitors in United States or Middle East. Ammonia production for fertilizers requires enormous natural gas inputs. European ammonia production costs approximately $500–700 per ton when gas is expensive. American production using cheap domestic gas costs approximately $250–400 per ton. The cost differential makes European production uncompetitive. BASF, Europe's largest chemical company, announced reducing European production and expanding American operations, where energy is 75% cheaper. Multiple chemical plants, steel mills, and manufacturing facilities announced closures, production cuts, or relocations to United States. The job losses are concentrated in industrial regions that depend on manufacturing. Germany's industrial heartland, Ruhr region, chemical clusters along Rhine, faces permanent employment decline as energy costs make operations unviable. The jobs relocating to United States or Middle East don't return when energy prices eventually stabilize, because capital investments follow companies when they relocate. Once a chemical plant is built in Louisiana instead of Germany, it operates there for decades, regardless of relative energy prices changing later. The industrial migration is creating permanent deindustrialization of parts of Europe. The climate implications are perverse. European climate policy aims to reduce emissions through renewable energy and industrial transformation. But high energy costs driving industrial migration means production shifts to countries with less stringent climate policies. Chemical production in United States uses natural gas, cleaner than coal but still fossil fuel. Steel production relocating to Asia might use coal. The emissions don't disappear. They just move outside European measurement boundaries. This is carbon leakage, where climate policy doesn't reduce emissions globally, but just relocates them while destroying European industrial capacity. The renewable energy expansion was supposed to provide alternative to fossil fuel dependence. Europe leads globally in renewable deployment, with wind and solar providing approximately 25% of electricity generation. But natural gas remains critical because renewables are intermittent. Wind and solar produce electricity when weather permits, but not on demand. Natural gas power plants provide backup generation when renewables aren't producing, and peak load capacity when demand spikes. The greater the renewable capacity, the more gas backup capacity is needed, not less. This is the renewable gas paradox, where increasing renewables increases rather than decreases gas dependence for grid reliability. The political tensions within Europe complicate unified energy policy. Germany prioritized Russian gas imports over diversification for years, despite Eastern European warnings. Baltic states and Poland opposed Nord Stream because it bypassed their territory and increased German-Russian ties. Spain and Portugal developed LNG import capacity that Central and Eastern Europe lacked. The fragmented energy infrastructure and political priorities meant European response to Russian supply loss was coordinated at high level, but implemented nationally with different results and continued recriminations about who was right about Russian dependence risks. The storage dimension matters because European gas demand is seasonal. Winter heating requires 3 to 4 times more gas than summer. Storage allows summer purchasing when prices are lower and demand is slack to meet winter peak. Europe built substantial storage capacity that can hold approximately 100 billion cubic meters, roughly 3 months of winter consumption. The storage provides buffer against supply disruptions, but requires filling during summer. The 2022 race to fill storage before winter created gas price spikes as European buyers competed globally for supply. The storage is insurance, but expensive insurance that must be continuously maintained. The infrastructure bottlenecks prevent simple solutions. Germany built LNG terminals on North Sea coast, but moving gas from coast to industrial users in southern Germany requires pipeline capacity that doesn't exist for LNG volumes. Spain has substantial unused LNG import capacity, but pipelines connecting Spain to France and Central Europe are limited. The gas physically can reach Europe but cannot efficiently reach where it's needed most. Building pipeline infrastructure takes years and billions in investment. The infrastructure gaps mean even when supply is available at European borders, delivering it to users requires substantial additional logistics and costs. The nuclear dimension is counterfactual, showing roads not taken. France generates 70% of electricity from nuclear power and has maintained relative energy security through crisis. Germany shut down its nuclear plants, pursuing renewable transition, and became heavily dependent on Russian gas for electricity generation and industrial use. The German decision now appears strategically disastrous. Reactivating nuclear plants is technically possible but politically difficult due to public opposition and regulatory requirements. The nuclear debate reveals how energy policy choices made decades ago for environmental or political reasons create strategic vulnerabilities that are difficult to reverse when crisis emerges. The question is whether European energy trap is temporary transition difficulty or permanent strategic weakness. The optimistic view is that high prices will incentivize renewable deployment, energy efficiency, and eventually lower costs. The pessimistic view is that industrial migration is permanent, competitiveness loss is structural, and Europe's position as manufacturing center is finished. The realistic assessment is probably between Europe will adapt, but at substantial cost in industrial capacity, living standards, and geopolitical influence. The comparison to 1970s oil shocks is instructive. The 1973 and 1979 oil crises created energy security concerns and price spikes that seemed catastrophic. But they drove efficiency improvements, alternative energy development, and economic adaptation that eventually reduced oil's importance. Whether European gas crisis follows similar path or creates permanent disadvantage depends on how quickly alternatives develop and whether industrial migration is temporary or permanent. The early evidence suggests the damage is substantial and recovery will take decades if it occurs at all. Europe escaped Russian energy dependence, but the alternative is dependence on American LNG, Qatari exports, Norwegian capacity constraints, and Algerian politics, each creating vulnerabilities and strategic costs. Europe is free from Russia but trapped by energy costs and dependencies that are geographically diversified but strategically complex. The energy trap is that escaping one dependence created multiple new ones that collectively might be even more constraining. Europe is discovering that energy security and energy independence are not the same thing. Security requires alternatives. But if all alternatives create dependencies, then security is illusion. Europe is dependent on everyone else now instead of being dependent on Russia. Whether that's improvement depends on whether collective dependencies are more reliable and sustainable than the single dependency Europe escaped. The evidence so far suggests otherwise. The long-term structural implications reveal why this matters beyond immediate energy costs. Europe's industrial competitiveness was built on reliable, cheap energy from Russia, advanced technology, skilled workforce, and proximity to markets. The energy advantage is now disadvantage. European natural gas prices averaged $30–40 per MWs in 2023 compared to $12–18 in United States and $8–12 in Middle East. This 2 to 3x cost differential compounds over decades of operations. The investment decisions follow energy costs. When multinational corporations plan new factories, refineries, or chemical plants, energy costs are primary location factor for energy-intensive industries. Before 2022, Europe was competitive location. Post-2022, Europe is expensive location avoided when alternatives exist. New investments flow to United States, Middle East, and Asia where energy is cheaper. The investment shift means Europe's industrial base stops growing and begins contracting as old facilities close and new facilities build elsewhere. The demographic crisis amplifies the problem. Europe's working-age population is declining due to low birth rates and aging. Industrial job losses from energy costs accelerate demographic decline in manufacturing regions. Younger workers leave areas with declining employment for cities or other countries with better opportunities. The regions become older, poorer, and less economically dynamic. The energy crisis isn't just an industrial problem, It's demographic accelerator that makes recovery harder. The geopolitical implications are that Europe becomes more dependent on United States for energy security, while simultaneously becoming less important to American strategic interests. American LNG supplies 20% of European gas. American security guarantees protect European energy infrastructure, but American priorities are shifting to Indo-Pacific competition with China. If American focus moves away from Europe, European energy and security dependencies on America create vulnerability. Europe escaped Russian dependency only to create American dependency that might be equally problematic if American commitment wavers. The fundamental question is whether Europe can build genuinely independent energy system based on renewables, nuclear, and domestic resources. The technical potential exists. European renewable resources are substantial. Nuclear technology is proven, and efficiency improvements can reduce demand. But the timeline is 20-30 years minimum and requires sustained political commitment and investment. Meanwhile, industrial migration is happening now, creating permanent losses that won't reverse even if energy costs eventually decline. The energy trap closes slowly, but the damage accumulates faster than solutions develop. The comparative advantage framework from economics explains why the damage is permanent. David Ricardo's theory holds that countries should specialize in industries where they have comparative advantage. Europe's comparative advantage in chemicals, steel, and manufacturing was built on cheap Russian energy combined with technical expertise. That comparative advantage is now destroyed. Even if European energy costs eventually decline to global averages through renewable development, the comparative advantage won't return because other regions have built capacity during Europe's high-cost period. The specific example of ammonia production illustrates the dynamic. European ammonia production capacity in 2020 was approximately 17 million tons annually. By 2024, capacity declined to approximately 13 million tons, a 25% reduction. The lost capacity relocated to United States Gulf Coast and Middle East, where new plants were built using cheap gas. These new plants will operate for 30 to 40 years. When European energy costs eventually decline, the global ammonia market will have surplus capacity. European plants won't restart because market doesn't need additional capacity. The comparative advantage shifted permanently to regions with cheap energy. The steel industry follows similar pattern. European steel production averaged 160 million tons annually pre-crisis. Production declined to approximately 130 million tons by 2023, a 20% reduction. Some decline reflects demand reduction from economic slowdown, but substantial portion reflects plants closing permanently due to energy costs. Indian and Middle Eastern steel capacity expanded during same period. When European demand recovers, imports will increase rather than European production restarting. The industrial capacity doesn't return once it relocates. The policy errors that created vulnerability are clear in retrospect. Germany's decision to close nuclear plants while maintaining Russian gas dependence was strategically incoherent. Nuclear provided reliable baseload electricity without imports. Closing nuclear increased gas dependence for electricity generation just as geopolitical risks were rising. The decision was driven by domestic environmental politics rather than strategic energy security analysis. The result was vulnerability that proved catastrophic when crisis emerged. Other European countries made similar errors, prioritizing short-term political or environmental goals over long-term strategic resilience.